Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cluster API Provider Azure Office Hours for Thursday, January 11th. We are a part of the CNCF via cluster SIG cluster Lifecycle and the Cluster API project. And as such, we abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct during public meetings. So please be kind to one another, raise hands to speak. We'd love to hear all voices. And without further ado, I will do the conventional announcement, even though as I look at the attendee list, I don't see any newcomers, but we love to welcome newcomers and give a chance for folks to say hi and introduce themselves. So I'll pause for a few seconds now. Okay, let's get on with the agenda. I'm looking for the share screen. Oh, it's the green one. That's why I didn't see it because it's a different color. And I'm going to share the agenda, Google Doc. Hopefully everyone can see. Great, I saw some thumbs up, so I'm going to go ahead and proceed. Okay, please add yourself to the attendee list if you're here. And let's go ahead and get through our agenda. So it looks like the first agenda item on the list is a walkthrough from John about his automating AKS features proposal. So the floor is yours, John.
Cool, thanks, Jack. Would you mind opening up that PR just so we can look at the proposal?
Yeah, I'm gonna also make you co-host. You don't have to do anything with that, but if you want to drive for any reason during this, you can take over.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, cool. Redirect successful.
Cool. Uh, all right, and then maybe look at the actual proposal itself. That might be the easiest.
Should we do, do we want to do the markdown view or the raw
Uh,
view?
yeah, the markdown view might be better.
Is that what rich diff is? No. Okay, cool. Here we go. All
All
right.
right. Yeah, so this is a proposal that has been open for a while and has gotten a lot of feedback. So thank you to those who have given feedback on this already. Just for a really quick recap, this is a proposal to basically leverage ASO to open up all of the available features that ASO exposes for AKS from CAPZ. So then we don't have to add individual features in PRs and test them and review them on an ongoing basis. Uh, so I thought of a few different ways that we could make that happen, and it's still not super clear that there's one kind of obvious good option. So I'm still looking for feedback on what folks think about the trade-offs for each, um, and if there are any other ways that we could do this. I am all ears. So just to kind of breeze through the options as kind of a summary. Uh, so for option one, this is where the CAPZ resource only references an existing ASO resource. So we would be modifying the, for example, Azure Managed Control Plane spec to have just a reference to an ASO managed cluster object. And this would make CAPZ essentially like a super thin layer in between CAPE and ASO, where CAPZ is kind of doing only the bare minimum functionality to fulfill the CAPE contract while letting the user kind of poke the ASO resource directly to change things that Cluster API doesn't necessarily care about, like OIDC issuer or other very AKS specific things. So the
I want
oh
to
yeah,
just
go ahead, Jack.
focus on this. This sentence seems super meaningful. So this would not be backwards compatible with the existing template structures and would actually require the users to update their templates to include the ASO spec in the template itself.
Correct. Yep.
Got it.
Yeah, and the other point with that is that since the ASO resource is a completely separate object, there's no good way to write a conversion webhook for like taking your existing Azure Managed Control Plane and then converting it to a new API version if we do put this in a new API version. So there's no good automated way to kind of bootstrap this new method of doing things.
Got it. So this sounds to me something like a V2 beta, whatever, of this is a V2 of this API. Sounds like to me.
Right. Yeah, I think I did mention in one of the later sections more about creating a new API version. But I
Got
guess
it.
in theory we could have this because we could just add this field to the existing struct and have things generally work. But yeah, I think probably fitting this stuff in a new API version makes the most sense, especially long term.
Any do we want to keep going or do we want to pause for feedback from folks?
Uh, or yeah, maybe just questions on kind of how this works. I think we'll kind of, as we get through more of them, we might get some more interesting thoughts on like the comparison between them. But does everybody kind of roughly understand how this would work? Cool.
I'm seeing nods, so I'm scrolling down.
All right. So to kind of wrap up option one, the main issue with option one is with cluster class, where uh, the cluster class API doesn't necessarily let us template arbitrary Kubernetes resources like we would need to for the ASO object. So yeah, there isn't really a good way to enable this in cluster class without a bunch of CAPI changes that may or may not be welcome by upstream CAPI. But yeah, I think that would enable option one for the most part. So then option two tries to address the cluster class issue by adding in kind of a hack where you're still referencing a separate ASO resource in the CabZ spec, but now CabZ will treat that reference as a template where then the Azure Managed Control Plane controller will essentially read the template and then generate a new ASO object based on that template. So then this template resource could presumably exist in the template with like the cluster class and the rest of the topology. And then that could be shared between all instances of that cluster class. But yeah, overall, this works mostly the same way, but just kind of with that difference. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I see this as just basically the same as option one with additional sort of class hierarchy wrapping to allow for horizontal duplication reuse.
Right. Yep.
Cool. Any other
Cool. So
questions on
then,
option two?
yeah.
No? Cool.
All right. So then option three is also kind of related, where now instead of having a completely separate resource for the ASO spec, we just basically copy paste that YAML inside the CabZ spec. So now everything is contained within the CabZ object. And so we don't need to like have that separate ASO resource. So the main issue with this now is since this is extremely generic, we can't leverage the ASO conversion webhooks or validating webhooks or the schema to validate that ASO YAML that's embedded inside the CabZ spec, unless presumably CabZ has some sort of like blessed set of ASO API versions that it knows about. That might get a little funky. But at least this kind of contains everything within the CabZ resource, and users can now modify the CabZ resource like they're more or less used to already, instead of having to go and touch the ASO resource. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So this would bring ASO's representation of the managed cluster into the template, but as just a big JSON blob that's a field value? Not,
It's not like one giant string value. This would still be somewhat structured, but it would be just like an arbitrary map of key value pairs.
okay, but it would be sort of first class YAML. I'm reading this wrong. It wouldn't just be a big blob of JSON. It would be map string interface, multiple
Right. Yeah, I think
values
I
that,
did note somewhere, or yeah, like the sense right underneath that code snippet where we could make this a huge blob string. But then writing patches for cluster class would get super gnarly for that, I think.
yeah, I think that would be bad. That's what I was trying to suss out.
Cool.
Thank you.
Or yeah, I think that's mostly it for option 3. Are there any other questions on option 3? Cool. So option 4 is very closely related to option 3, with the exception that now the huge embedded representation of the ASO object is the literal ASO type. So this would give us all of the schema validation. We might be able to use their webhook, their validating webhook logic in here too, if that may require some changes, but I think the ASO folks would be amenable to making that available if it's not super gnarly to do that. So the main problem that we've found with this option is that when we want to update the AKS API version, just rolling the new ASO API version in this struct could cause issues with conversion webhooks because ASO, since every single AKS API version is a separate ASO Kubernetes API version, ASO does implement some non-trivial conversion webhook stuff between those versions. So we would not always be able to just roll this API version without also bumping the CabZ resource API version, which might get fairly gnarly pretty fast. But yeah, otherwise, this works more or less the same as option 3. Are there any questions on how that works?
It seems mostly similar to option 2 to me, naively. What's the difference between, I mean, I know it's this. So the difference here is less generic type structure of the reference from the template.
Right. Yeah, and well, because option 4, you're still embedding the whole ASO spec inside the CabZ resource. So you still don't have a separate ASO resource that you'd have to poke around at to make changes. You could
I
still
see.
just tweak the CabZ resource.
So it actually is the same with a reduced layer of indirection, because this is going to point to ultimately to this, right? To something of using this example API version.
Right. Yep.
Can you unpack some of the gnarliness that you're talking about with the rolling a new API version?
Yeah. So basically, if you're using plain ASO, so this is not cluster API at all. If you just want to use plain ASO and manage a managed cluster, then presumably you will create it with some API version. And then if you want to use some feature that's only present in a new API version, then the ASO will perform some conversion webhook logic in between those versions to make sure that if you had some field in the old API version that you created, then if that is somehow changed in the new API version, then it can do that conversion so that whatever you had before is still valid automatically in the new API version.
Yep.
But if we want to just bump this ASO API version inside the CabZ spec without also bumping the CabZ API version and mirroring that same conversion webhook logic, then we would be losing that. So that could cause issues that you wouldn't see with using ASO more or less normally. And I guess the conversion webhook stuff would still apply if you had that separate ASO resource where ASO would, because ASO knows how to deal with those, and it could do that automatically. I hope that kind of
Well,
makes sense. Go
I
ahead.
think I understand the delta between choosing not to sort of bypassing ASO's conversion foo as a safeguard to keep things a little bit more stable, because in this case we're simply bumping the API version. We're not intending to actually change the declarative spec. So let's say we don't do that and we just opt into all of the potential conversion surface area that ASO is going to provide with the new version. Is the gnarliness going to be that cluster is essentially going to be re-reconciled for no practical reason? I mean, on a practical perspective, things are going to get rolled and recycled so that the updated declarative spec agrees with the basically, is it going to change the goal state, which is going to require a full reconciliation of the cluster, which is going to require operational thrashing that wouldn't otherwise be there? Is that really what the gnarliness is about?
I'm not sure about that. I think I would have to dig into that a little more to
So is the
figure that
gnarliness that
out.
we just don't, we're taking it on some degree of risk that those conversions will fail?
Well, I think the issue is that there will be no conversion. So whatever the conversions are trying to fix will fail. So like if there's some uh like a field introduces or like is an enum and it takes away a value or something like that. If that
Yeah.
value isn't converted in the new API version to whatever the new default is or something, then the next reconcile will fail because all of a sudden you have an invalid value in your
I see. So
resource.
we're saying that we can't actually plumb together CapZ and ASO in such a way where those conversions actually work reliably.
I think with this option 4, that's the case. Yep.
Got it. Okay, so Nawaz, you were first.
Thanks, Jack. How does option 4 work when, say, a user is stuck to some V1 2023-0201, and there have been 3 releases of ASO for managed clusters, and the user is still using the spec, which is 4 versions old. Uh, will will the conversion webhook still take care of updating this old spec, which is present inside the CAPI, to match and reconcile the resource on ASO side?
So I guess for as long as CapZ is using this API version, it will keep using that API version. And if that API version has to still exist in ASO for as long as we want to use it, because eventually ASO might remove this API version and then we would have to update, but hopefully there's enough overlap in between ASO releases where we can do that kind of iteratively without worrying about having some period of time where people like have to upgrade now or else things are broken. I feel like I didn't quite hear your whole question. Yeah, go ahead, Nawaz.
Um, I mean, I'm asking more in terms of user intervention. Once they say they upgrade their CRDs, do they also have to update their specs, which are already running inside the cluster since the version has changed?
Yes. So like if we do bump this API version in here, then yes, there might be some required changes by users if there are incompatibilities between those two API versions. But I think generally AKS tries to keep things backwards compatible.
I see. One more thing, Matt, sorry, I'll jump in. So comparing option 4 to option 2 gives us that abstraction of, uh, I mean, users, please correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I feel like if we are going with option 2, the users don't need to update the spec because in the end, the conversion logic at the CAPZ level would take care of it. But is that not the case?
No, yeah, that is the case. Yeah, ASO can do most of that conversion stuff for you. You might have to do some copy paste, whatever, to actually get that to end up in your template. But yes, ASO would do all of that conversion automatically, as far as I understand.
Okay. Just from the UX perspective, then wouldn't option 2 be better then? Because user need not update a lot of stuff once the spec is in.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm leaning toward, is option 2 overall being slightly more preferable to option 4.
I see. Okay. The last question was because I read the decision. It says we are going forward with option 4. So
Right, yeah, that's kind of a stale. I should maybe just remove that for now, since it's a little less clear at the moment. Because yeah, I think we started settling on that kind of before the new year, and then I thought of the conversion webhook thing, which I feel like is significant enough where it might be worth considering option 2 or 3.
Matt?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah. So obviously, maybe not having conversion webhooks run is a real problem here. But were you also saying, so this, I think, has the advantage of allowing us to embed very explicitly this, the managed cluster spec from ASO, and having everything in one declarative document seems much more user friendly. But whenever we want to rev the API that ASO has provided, the AKS API that ASO is making available to us, I think you were saying, and this seems to imply that we would have to rev our API as well, right? Because it's literally part of Azure Managed Control Plane class spec here. Is that true? Would we have to be bumping our API by patch or minor versions often?
I think if
Is
we
that
do want to leverage that conversion webhook logic from ASO, then yes. I don't know if there is a way, maybe if we embed some extra metadata in here, I don't know, that might get,
yeah.
I don't know if that would even be possible. But yeah, I think we would need to, like, when we bump the ASO API version, we bump the CAPZ API version.
Right. That sounds like a big headache because, it's a fair amount of work, but maybe we could streamline it so that's kind of a no-op and not really a big deal, and we're just bumping a minor or hash version number or something. But that seems like a knock against number 4.
Yeah.
Otherwise, but for that and the webhooks, I think number 4 would be the winner, but I'm really not sure.
Yeah, go ahead,
Nawaz.
Nawaz.
Uh, just trying to understand the complete picture of conversion webhooks. So when you say conversion webhooks, are we talking about mutating webhooks from version to version? Say someone has put in some field and that field gets deprecated going ahead, and it's the job of conversion webhook to keep both the versions reconciled. Is this what we mean by conversion webhooks?
Yeah, so conversion webhooks basically just shuffle between API versions. So essentially, when you create a Kubernetes resource, this is any Kubernetes resource, you create it through a specific API version, but then you can still get or operate against that resource in any other convertible API version. The API version is essentially just kind of an interface into the resource, but it's all still the same resource. So there's no such thing as like a V1 pod and a V1 beta 1 pod. If those two things existed, it would all still be the same pod. It's just two different ways you can look at it, essentially.
Makes sense.
So the conversion webhooks basically do that conversion between like the resource itself, however that's stored, and then however you want to see it. So it's all still the same resource. It just looks slightly different. But yeah, that's what the conversion webhooks do. So that's distinct from the mutating and validating webhooks.
Okay.
But to be clear, it's the job of the conversion webhooks to make what you described, John, possible. The same
Correct, yeah.
resource viewed two different ways. Those two different ways that they're being viewed they have to be mutually compatible, and it's the conversion webhook's job to render those in a mutually compatible way so you can go back and forth. Okay.
Cool. Any other
I'll take.
questions? Yeah, go ahead, Waz.
I have a couple of questions. I think Noah's just doing a thumbs up.
Oh, I see.
Sorry, I'm not raising my hands like I announced at the beginning of the meeting.
Jack.
Yes, thank you, John. We aren't doing this anywhere else. So just to be clear, I think for the historical record, because we're already using ASO across almost all of the CAPC surface area by this point, by January 2024. This is novel in the sense that we are embedding in some form or another, we're proposing to embed the ASO resource itself as part of the template. So that's why these are novel problems that we didn't encounter 6 to 9 months ago when we were doing the conversion away from the SDK. Is that a fair, simplified summary of things?
Yep.
So these are all novel discoveries. Okay, cool. That seems clear to me. Is it worth outlining an option 5? Don't do this, because the cost of doing this, are we overloading the term automation here? Because it doesn't sound very automated, any of these options, in fact. So is it worth doing the exercise of costing the maintenance of this, in quotes, automation versus the cost of the current world where we have none of this quote unquote automation? Obviously, the reason we're doing the automation is to reduce maintenance costs, but I feel like maybe we're at the point where it's worth just sanity checking if we're actually going to be sort of a net positive engineering cycle state after we were to do any of these 4 options.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a reasonable thing to do. And yeah, I think making that an option 5 sounds good to me. I can add that to the doc.
Just to be clear, this is something I should have said earlier. This is great work. Whether or not if we were to pursue not doing it, this is definitely not a waste of time. This is like fantastic work, and I would almost want to, if we don't do this, let's merge this proposal just so we have this on the books with the decision to not do it based on all the extremely thorough work, the discovery work that was done. Is anybody else feeling more confident about one or the other options, or about considering not doing this after this presentation? Cecile, I know you've spent more time than any of us considering this up to this point. No, go ahead, Nawaz.
I'm more inclined on option number 2, just because it has got a better UX from the customer perspective rather than option 4. But apart from that, I mean, this is really good work.
I think Cecile was first and then John.
Yeah, I was a strong advocate for option 4 before the conversion webhook story, and now I don't know. I to be honest, I don't see how option 2 is better UX wise, because now as a user you end up having to maintain 2 objects instead of 1 and define the 2 objects, and you're having to care about understanding ASO directly, which the goal of CAPZ was to abstract that away and have it really be like ASO is a detail, an implementation detail. And let's say in 2 years, there's a new project that does declarative Azure resource management that's not ASO, and we wanted to swap that in. We could do that without any disruptions to the user, in theory, if we weren't to use option 2. Now, if we're using option 2, there's a direct dependency between the user and ASO as a specific project. That's kind of the thing that makes me not love option 2. So I feel like at this point we're kind of in a position where none of the options are perfect. They all have their trade-offs, which I guess is always the case for a design decision. But I think it might be worth exploring, like, can we mitigate the issues with option 4? Because other than the issue with the webhooks, I think everything else in my mind is slightly better. But yeah, I think we should consider option 5 for sure at this point.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm almost wondering if, I guess for me, like my ideal long-term moonshot thing would be more option 1 with the CAP-E changes. I wonder if CAP-E would be amenable to making this ASO-like pattern kind of a first-class thing where just like how a CAP-E cluster references an Azure implementation of the cluster, we could have the Azure cluster reference and implementation of the ASO resources. So, I mean, to me, at least, that kind of abstraction seems fairly consistent, at least in the CAP-E world. And then providers become these super thin layers that are just shuffling back and forth between the CAP-E interface and the actual infrastructure representation. To me, that seems like a fairly compelling thing, but obviously that's a super long-term idealistic view of things that might not be super practical in the even medium term. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, in fact, you may be fortunate enough to converge with the Carpenter provider for CAPI, which may run into something similar here. So the current discussion, so Mike Klimo is leading this. The current discovery path is toward having a sort of, I don't want to go into too much details. Basically, imagine a separate Carpenter reconciler, almost similar to how we're using ASO as a separate reconciler that sits as a sibling to the CAPI controller and the CAPZ controller. So imagine a Carpenter provider that's CAPI aware, that's creating orphan machine. I mean, orphan in terms of like no machine deployment, no machine pool wrapper that's going to sit inside a cluster. So there's something similar there where we haven't even really broached the subject of cluster class, but I don't think that there's a cluster class story for that type of approach for Carpenter as well. And so the reason I bring that up is it's possible that there is some overlap between the sort of architectural novelty here between this and Carpenter that could get a little bit more critical mass towards building consensus for changing CAPI. The other thing I wanted to say, and then I'll call on Cecile, is this option 1? So are these ellipses here, this ... does that suggest that the current opinionated CAPZ spec of an Azure managed control plane will be durable and there's like little story for the users other than as they upgrade to the CAPZ version that would support this approach, they would then get automatically injected that managed cluster ref, which would then refer to an ASO object. But from a user's perspective, they don't have to really care about it. They're still managing their AKS cluster with CAPZ API specs.
So I think the 3 dots were meant to represent all of the current existing fields in the spec. And I think at first I was thinking about just adding these fields without touching anything else and leaving everything completely backwards compatible, but then having this be kind of like a separate experimental side path to doing things. But I guess the more I think about it, the more I like just kind of creating a completely new API version that's not backwards compatible and would just have this field and whatever else we might need in addition to that.
Cool. And then thank you. The final thing I just wanted to point out, just in terms of an option 5 to consider, is as we enumerate all these potential paths forward with ASO being a sort of first class property of CAPZ, we don't really have a path forward away from ASO 3 years from now. So I think we obviously aren't planning on changing over from the SDK APIs to ASO because we think we're going to change again in 2 or 3 years. But just from a durability point of view of the project, we're thinking here through all the disadvantages of having to manually curate the set of downstream features that we're giving to our users on behalf of AKS. The disadvantages of we have to literally continue evolving our opinionated spec to accommodate the evolution of the downstream resources. But the advantage we get that is actually supports like reduced engineering investment overall in the long term is that protects whatever implementation detail we use to actually fulfill those resources from the user. And so when something happens to ASO or Azure SDK, we can adapt without really harming the user, which I feel like we can confidently say we did 6 to 9 months ago when we adapted from SDK v2 to ASO. We benefited from that additional layer of wrapping, even though from one point of view, it's a lot of work to do that. But if we go down really any of these options, we're kind of backing ourselves into a corner where there's no way that we can make a further evolution without harming our users in the future. Like we're basically married to ASO. Does that sound reasonable, what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay, I'll shut up and pass over to Cecile. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, I think your last point also kind of brings to what I was gonna say, which I just saw Noaz's question chat saying, wasn't option 2 still abstracting ASO? So, I mean, John, please correct me if I'm wrong, and Noaz too, but my understanding is with option 2 as a user, I will now, I will have an object reference in my manage control plane cluster spec. And then that object reference is actually an ASO managed cluster object, which means I, as a user, also need to define an ASO managed cluster object. And the particularity of that option is also that that managed cluster object isn't actually getting reconciled because we're putting the skip policy on it. We're just using it as a template, but it's not meant to be a template, which means there are fields in there that could be only per cluster, which if I define those fields anyways, because I don't know as a user, I would back myself into a corner and basically my managed cluster would fail to come up, or my second managed cluster or third would fail to come up. So this requires the user to have specific knowledge and understanding of ASO and how it works and which fields are meant for what. And they're having to define the object themselves as opposed to were us like hiding it away as a CABZ object and then being able to, build on top of that, I guess. So in some sense, all of these options are getting us further away from abstracting ASO because we're now exposing it to the user directly. But I think some of these options are doing that more directly in the sense that they're like option 1 and 2 are, requiring the user to directly define the resource. So yeah, John.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point that like being tied to ASO is kind of a spectrum, right? Where we can be tied more closely in some ways than others. And I think for all of these, you could make some very loose argument that these don't technically tie us to ASO, they just tie us to something ASO equivalent or something that speaks the ASO API or an equivalent API. So presumably something else could exist in the future that isn't ASO, but is still compatible enough that we could use it. But yeah, I think the overall point here is that like it's not directly tied to ASO where like it's literally impossible for us to use anything except ASO in the future. I think there is some wiggle room there, but it's definitely like 99% less wiggle room than we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt's point, I actually want to clarify. So Matt's point earlier about API good citizenship, if we're going to be consuming new versions of this, we really want to be revving this as well. I think we can literally not do that, but I think that that's potentially wrong. Is that something that applies to all 4 of these options or really just option 4 with the embedded version in the spec itself?
Do you mind if I take that, Cecile? Yeah, so with options 1, 2, or 3, the user is allowed to define any API version for ASO that they want. So as long as that's a compatible API version installed, then they're free to use that. So if I want to use a new feature in a new AKS API version using options 1, 2, or 3, then I think as long as the user bumps the API version in their ASO resource, then makes any other required changes that come with that API bump, then users should be able to start using that new API version without even touching CabZ at all, no upgrade or anything else.
Yeah, it
Um,
seems slightly unfair to describe that as not touching CapC because we're the ones forcing them to touch ASO. So I'm not sure the user benefit there. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar. I think like with freedom comes with more responsibility, right? Like I don't know if that's an actual saying, but we're putting burden, like more burden on the user. And so we're allowing them to have more control on the resources that they create in the versions of the APIs. But if they don't want that control, they don't have a choice now. So, and I'm just, if we take a step back and we put ourselves in the shoes of a user who's coming from a non-Azure background, maybe like is using Cluster API on another infrastructure and tries out CabZ, so they're already familiar with the Cluster API resources, objects, everything. But when they were using Kappa 2 weeks ago, they didn't have to create all these extra cloud resources. And now they're coming over to CabZ and they're like having to figure out which API version of the ASO managed cluster API or object they should use. And that's really a detail they might not want to care about. So we're just increasing the complexity, which like, yes, we're giving more control, but I think we're also putting a lot more burden on the user to do what's right.
Yeah, is it fair to say that the sort of mission statement here, the reason we want to automate AKS features is to increase CapC user satisfaction and adoption by providing a product that more closely mirrors the AKS, the real AKS? Like we're doing this on behalf of users. We're not just selfishly doing this because, boy, it'd be great if we could stop spending time maintaining CapZ. We're really trying to serve users by giving them a more reliable stream of AKS features.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of the CabZ maintenance burden is driven by that user desire, I guess.
Well, but I
Sorry,
think the
didn't raise
thing
my-
is that you could make an argument that you could, if you're really taking a step back, you could read a proposal like this as shifting the burden from the CapC development team to the user community. And that's where, like, that's not the purpose of this proposal. So we want to try to find an option, and the option might not exist, but we want to try to find an option that does all of that additional automation on behalf of the user at no cost to the user. Go ahead, Nawaz.
I'd like to second what Cecile was saying, that we'd be asking user to have an understanding of ASO as well. I think a couple of our customers, say Adobe and I'm not sure if Cloud Kitchens, but they are also having multiple setups, Kappa, and they contribute to Cappy, and they're also trying to consume CapZ. So I think all of these options are sort of pushing us into getting married to ASO, as you mentioned. But if there could be any other option where we could abstract it still like the way it is right now and still have automating AKS APIs, that'd be super great. Just trying to add my voice on what Cecile said.
Cool, thank you. I've been a very bad host because selfishness has been really interesting. There are more agenda items, I think. Are we already too late, Willie, to cover yours?
No, it's just like a quick PSA to review it, a PR, just because it's a kind of a big PR and might take a while between like review cycles. So
okay, cool. So just wait 1 second.
Yeah,
thank you.
go ahead.
So I just want to make sure that are we at a place where I think we benefited massively by this. So thank you so much, John. Thanks for all the background work. Thanks for the super, super clear explanation. It was definitely really useful for me to understand all this stuff, to hear you walk through it. So I think that was a very effective call to arms. So please, everyone, go. We talked through a lot of this stuff and it'll be recorded, which is great, but let's go put some of those thoughts into the proposal. I think that's the most sort of community inclusive way to document what we've been doing for the past 50 minutes. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep that open for myself. And I will click through here. And Willie, go ahead.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, just super quick. Been working on this for a while and want to get it in by the review or the release. It's just I think the review cycle kind of got interrupted with like me going out of office and all the winter stuff. So yeah, John already did like a whole like thorough review. So this is like the second round. So yeah, just appreciate if someone could take a look. That's all.
I mean, the description sounds kind of amazing. Great work. Sounds super cool.
Yeah, it's cool. You get to basically just add, like you create your fleet manager by yourself, like you via the portal or CLI, and you can add your like CAPZ clusters to it.
Is it a handoff? Does CAPZ essentially say bye-bye? Or
No,
is there going to be
CAPZ,
co-management between CAPZ and AKS Fleet going forward?
it's like co-management because the CAPZ still reconciles this cluster, but you can use all the features of the fleet manager as well. So
That
it's not
sounds
like,
kind of amazing.
yeah,
So
it's like,
basically, Fleet is willing to delegate the particular single cluster configuration to something like CAPZ, but then add on top that all of the foo that AKS Fleet provides for multi-cluster
right. So
support.
this makes it easier to like provision the clusters and scale them relative to like Fleet, where you kind of have to add them manually, like you have to create the clusters and add them to the Fleet manually. So it's just another way to like manage the clusters inside the Fleet.
Cool. I think you're understating things. It sounds really powerful. All right, great. Go review. We don't have time to do milestone review and issue review. I'm going to propose. This was a really fun one. I'll upload the recording soon. Go ahead, Willie.
Should we still kind of like go over this stuff like maybe on our own or offline because the release is next week?
Go over Fleet.
No, I meant the release milestones and stuff because it's the release is next week.
Well, we're basically out of time, and do we want to vote to stay over?
Oh, I just meant like doing so async or on a different meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could do that. If we want to do it later today, we can post on CAPZ Slack a Zoom link and invite folks maybe like with an hour ahead of time notice. I know it's not going to include people in the sort of far eastern time zones of the world, but or we could do it tomorrow morning. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion, like if people think that'll be helpful.
Great. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Jack.
Yep.
See everybody.